Welcome again to the media ministry of Covenant of Grace Bible Church. This week, Pastor Mark continues his series in the book of Romans as he brings us part 2 of a message in answer to the question, what have we been saved for? Exactly why were we saved? So let's get your Bibles, open up to the first chapter of Romans, and be ready to follow along with Pastor Mark.
Things are not going to get better. You may see gas prices dip back just a little bit in the future, maybe, not before the end of summer, I assure you, but they're going to go back. They're not getting better. There is a time in which the United States of America, as hard as it will be for especially those of us who have served in the uniform of this country, there will be a time when this country will greatly diminish, and right now is diminishing, in its military, economic, and political influence around the world, because that's what the Bible says. When you look into the future, the United States of America is not there. The nations that are there are listed. They're named. You can find them geographically. But the United States of America is not listed. That is either because it no longer exists or because it is so weak militarily, economically, and politically that it really is insignificant in world affairs. There is a time when this nation makes that turn, and we made that turn a long time ago, and when we will reap and we will not enjoy, certainly not enjoy, but we will begin to suffer the consequences of the choices that this nation has made years ago and continues to make in running away from God. Things are not going to get better. Gas prices are going to go up. Food prices are going to continue to go up as the Lord continues to bring disaster upon disaster, not only upon the world, but upon this nation. Have you not noticed? Have you not noticed what is going on in our country? Does it not resonate in your heart to some degree that God is working and that God is bringing the hammer down and God is saying, it's time. It's time that we have a talk. It's time that we eyeball one another and we deal with your sin. Things aren't going to get better. The war in Iraq, we look at it now and we say, well, there just seems to be this little lull. Let me tell you, things haven't lulled, and things are probably going to pick up, and there may very well be a new enemy. When we look at the presidential election and we look at the possibilities that we have to elect to the Oval Office, I don't know about you, but it scares me to death. And then I think to myself, we're going to get what we deserve. We will get what we deserve. Things are not going to get better. Things are going to get worse. And Christians who really believe, true believers, are going to be given more and more and more opportunities to live and to use and to lose their resources to make much of Christ in a country and in a world that is on a downhill spiral from which they will never recover. You know, Dick was sharing with me that before Katrina hit, you wouldn't find a whole lot of Christians flocking to New Orleans. That wasn't the vacation spot of choice for Christians. And now when you look at the city of New Orleans, if it weren't for the Christians, there probably would not be a city of New Orleans being rebuilt. You could say that over and over again for all over the world where there are disasters. Christians wouldn't normally have flocked to those areas, but Christians are flocking to those areas now because they're using their resources, they're risking their lives to make much of Christ in areas that desperately need the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is going to continue and continue. We have a wonderful opportunity to be used by God and to use and to lose our resources in making much of Christ. And let me just say that if you're a Christian and you think that you're still living in the day when you can accumulate your resources for yourself, you're going to lose them. You are going to lose them. You're going to lose them. You really are. I can remember serving in a church that had $40-some thousand in CDs in the bank and yet would not pay its staff a living wage. I knew I was leaving. I was on my way out because I couldn't afford to feed my family any longer on what they were willing to pay. And they wouldn't give me permission to get another job. And so I preached a sermon. And in the sermon, I simply said this: use it or lose it. They chose to lose it. And the Lord burned the church down a couple of years later. Use it or lose it. But things are not going to get better. Now, I think Dwayne prayed that we would have an uplifting or something that would uplift us in our spirit. So that's it. Things aren't getting better. They're not. And if you're in a fantasy land where you think they are, you're in trouble. Let me tell you this. If you're in debt, you better get out of debt. You better start working to get out of debt. Because when everything starts to collapse and they call for the loan, you say, oh man, the rapture will come and I'll just get in a lot of debt because I don't have to pay anything. It's not going to get better. And that's why God told us our citizenship is not here. Where's our citizenship? Heaven. It's in heaven. Where's our loyalty? It's in heaven. Sometimes when you begin to preach messages like this, some people will take it the wrong way and they'll say, boy, you're not much of a patriot, are you? You're not very loyal to your country. You're saying we're going down. Yeah, I am. And I am loyal to my country. But you know what? My citizenship is not here. My citizenship is in heaven. And when things start to get rough, when things start to get bad, and you begin to hear things are not going to get better, and you watch the news and you see what's going on around you, and you know things are not going to get better. Oh, they might have a little reprise, but they're not going to get better. Then we need to start thinking about the fact that that's part of God's plan. And all of that helps to get us ready for our real home, which is heaven. Our real home is not here. It was never meant to be here. Our real home is in heaven. That's why Jesus said to His disciples in John 14, don't let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. He says, don't be troubled. Believe in God, believe in me. I'm going to prepare a place for you. Today we're going to talk about what God has saved us for, or where God has saved us for. You know, we have been in Romans 1:16 dealing with that little word salvation for several weeks now. We saw that God had saved us from Himself and from His wrath. We saw that God saved us from His wrath in hell. Last week we saw that God saved us to enjoy Himself. Because in enjoying God, we glorify God. When we find our pleasure in God, when we find our joy in God, when we find our delight in God, when He really is our greatest treasure and our greatest pleasure, then God is glorified and we are most happy. We are most happy. Well, today we're going to look at where God has saved us for. And that would be heaven. You know, one of my favorite subjects to think about, to read about, to study about, to imagine, to daydream about is heaven. But to be very honest with you, there's very little written about heaven in the theological world. Most of your systematic theology books give very little space to heaven. It's so interesting to me that John Calvin, one of my heroes, who wrote The Institutes of the Christian Religion, says hardly anything about heaven other than that's the eternal home of the believer. Martin Lloyd-Jones, another one of my heroes, in his 900-page book entitled Great Doctrines of the Bible, gives 2 pages to heaven. Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, which you guys that are in men's seminary have and have read, at least part of it, 1,200 pages, and he devotes 7 pages to heaven. Now, the reason that most of these authors don't give a lot of space to heaven is because indirectly or directly, they do not think that God has given us enough information about heaven that we can really imagine what heaven is going to be like. And whereas it is true that there's much about heaven that's hard for us to picture completely, I don't think the Bible teaches that heaven is unimaginable and undiscernible to us. In fact, I think the Bible teaches just the opposite. I think that heaven is imaginable because God has provided us with revelation about heaven, and because He has wired into the Christian a longing for heaven. Now, if you live long enough as a believer, you will have a longing for heaven. And that longing is produced by trials and temptations and loss. One of the reasons why God takes things from us and begins to cut the cords to things that would tie us to earth is because God is giving us a longing and a taste for heaven. And the longer that you live, the more you're going to lose. And the more you lose, the greater a taste you will have for heaven. In fact, there will come a time in many of our lives, if we live long enough, where we will have more in heaven than we do on earth. Where you will have more family members in heaven, and more loved ones in heaven, and more treasure in heaven than you do on earth. And you begin to realize that heaven really is my home. And so when you go through those losses, and you go through those trials, and you go through those temptations, and you go through those experiences that just rip you apart, understand what God is doing is cutting the strings to earth. Some of us have thicker strings than others, and it takes a sharper pair of scissors. It takes a lot longer with a knife cutting. Some of us have ropes that are tying us to earth. Some of us have steel cables tying us to earth, and God has to use cutters to take those out. Be careful about how entwined you become with the things of earth, because God will cut them eventually. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Again, in Romans 1:16, Paul tells us that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to those who believe. The word salvation means to be rescued from something and delivered to something else. You're rescued from God's wrath and you are delivered to God's joy. And part of that deliverance to God's joy is heaven. He saved us that we would live with Him in heaven for all of eternity. Now in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 to 13, and Dwayne read that for us this morning, the context is talking about God's wisdom. But if you leave it there, you've missed the whole point, because it's talking about God's wisdom in His eternal plan for the believer, and specifically for the believer's glory. Look what it says in verse 6. Yet we do speak wisdom among those who are mature. A wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away. But we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages to our glory. He's talking about this wonderful wisdom that was a mystery. In other words, it was not known fully before. But this mystery has to do with something that God foreordained in eternity past, and which concerns our glory, our glorification. He says, the wisdom which none of the rulers of this age has understood, for if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But just as it is written, things which eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love Him. The verbs that are used there are future tense. We're talking about those things that God ordained in eternity past for the believer's glory, that He was going to prepare for the believer. Not only in bringing him to glory, but also that he would enjoy in his glorified state. And he says, the eye has not seen what these things would be. The ear has not heard what these things will be, nor has entered completely into the heart or the imagination of man all that God has prepared for those who love Him. It's important to recognize that He does have a certain group of people in mind. He is not talking universally about all men. He's not saying that God has great things prepared for everybody. In fact, for the non-believer, God has terrible things prepared, and we've looked at those things. But for the person who loves Him, He has prepared wonderful, wonderful things. Verse 10, "For to us God revealed them through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so the thoughts of God no one knows except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may know the things," here's the things that the eye can't see, the ear can't hear, have not completely entered into the hearts of man, "so that we may know these things freely given to us by God. Which things we also speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words." You know, that last phrase really gives you part of the job description of the preacher in preaching. You know, if all you do when you preach is you get up here and you pull out the commentaries and you just give out information. Here's all the information you could ever want about that text. You're not preaching. Preaching is when you get behind the words and you find the spiritual concepts, the spiritual thoughts that are behind those spiritual words, and you draw those out and you present those. And what he's saying here is that God ordained in eternity past wonderful things for our glory. Wonderful things which our eyes have not yet seen, our ears have not yet heard, and completely has not entered into our hearts and minds, our imagination, what He has prepared for those of us who love Him. And these are things that have been freely given to us. Now, it's interesting, even though we're not enjoying heaven yet, because we're not enjoying our glory yet, we're not glorified yet, we still are enjoying these things in the sense that we can anticipate them. We can look forward to them. We can imagine them. And that's what Paul wants us to do. He wants us to think about heaven. He wants us to begin to contemplate heaven. He wants us to begin to imagine what it will be like and to experience that joy of what heaven will be. Now in verse 12, he says, "Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit is from God, so that we may know the things." The word know is eido in Greek. It means to know something in the sense of being able to look at it, being able to gaze at it, behold it, study it, contemplate it, wonder about it, think about it, and muse about it. It's talking about taking something and holding it up and just gazing at it and trying to see everything that's there. And that's what God wants us to do when it comes to the things that He has freely given us and that we will experience on the day that we enter into heaven. Now, what I want us to do today is to think about heaven. And as we think about heaven, what I want us to do is to understand some of the things that the Bible tells us about heaven. And the first thing I want us to understand is that there are two heavens. There's two heavens that we are actually going to reside in. We're not going, when we die, to the heaven where the streets are made of gold. And in fact, if you've got loved ones in heaven right now, I hate to tell you, they're not walking on streets of gold right now. That's the final heaven. I want you to go over to Revelation chapter 21. Let's start looking at what God has prepared for us finally in the new heaven and in the new earth, and then transitionally in the present heaven. I could tell from the looks on many of your faces that that was a new thought. Because we sing about it, and we talk about it, and we have in our mind that when we get to heaven, we're going to be walking on streets that are paved with gold. Well, we will, but not yet. We will, but not yet. In Revelation 21, verses 1 through 5, you have a description of the final and permanent heaven. the final dwelling place of the person who loves Jesus Christ, who has Jesus Christ as their greatest treasure and pleasure in life. It says in Revelation 21, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven," that's the heaven that exists right now, "for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea." Nance, can you bring me the water? No longer any sea. "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and He will dwell among them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself will be among them.'" Okay, the new heaven and the new earth is going to be that heaven that God creates after He destroys the present heaven and the present earth. Now, if you look up at Revelation chapter 20, verse 11, you'll see where this is destroyed. At the great white throne, where He brings all the unbelievers of all of the ages before Him for judgment, before He actually judges them, look at verse 11. "Then I saw a great white throne and Him who sat upon it." Jesus is the one sitting upon it. "From whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them." It's metamorphical language that is describing the fact that at this time, as Christ is about to judge the sins of every person who has ever lived, who has not run to Him for forgiveness, that the old heaven and the old earth is going to be destroyed. If you look at 2 Peter, you'll see where Peter talks about the fact that they're going to be destroyed. And the reason they're going to be destroyed is because they've been tainted by sin. In fact, this earth is ruined by sin. It's been cursed because of our sin. We see that in Genesis chapter 3. And it continually is more and more ruined by sinners. So it's no surprise to us that this old earth is going to be destroyed. But the present heaven that exists is also going to be destroyed, because that heaven has also been tainted with sin in the form of Satan and his angels who rebelled against God. And so at the great white throne, when Jesus puts away all sin in judging all sinners, He is also going to destroy the old heaven and the old earth. And so there's going to be a need for a new heaven and a new earth. And this new heaven and this new earth is going to be qualitatively different than the heaven that you and I will go to when we die. I want you to see what the new heaven is going to be like, and then we'll look at the heaven that exists now. But it's going to be qualitatively different. Look at 21:1 again. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." The word new is kainos in Greek. It's not talking about a remodel. It's not talking about something and simply giving it a facelift. It's talking about something that is going to be completely and qualitatively brand new. Something that is not like it was in the past. In fact, will have many, many new facets that were never even part of the old heaven. If you look up at verse 4, it says, "And He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And He who sits on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" The phrase "first things" is actually translated the first order. It's the word prototype, or protos in Greek. The idea being that the first order of creation, earth and heaven, are going to be destroyed. They're no longer going to exist. The first order, the first way that God put things together, will no longer exist. And rather, in verse 5, He is going to make all things completely new. Now, if you want to get an idea of maybe one aspect of how it's going to be new, look at verse 1 again of chapter 21. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea." Now, people read that and they hear it preached and they're disappointed because they really love the ocean. They love water. And they say, oh, I don't understand. Why is God going to make a new heaven and a new earth and there's not going to be any ocean? I mean, I love the ocean. I don't think that's what it's saying. How many seas are on the earth? Is there just one? No, there's a lot of seas on the earth. This is not talking about the fact that there won't be any sea on the earth. What he's talking about is this. A sea is a gulf. Oceans separate land masses which have people on them so that they can't come together. What he's talking about here when he says there is no longer any sea is that heaven and earth are not going to be separated anymore. Heaven and earth are going to be joined together, and there will not be a sea separating heaven and earth. That's why he says, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men. He will dwell among them. They shall be His people, and God Himself will be among them. I've heard many preachers, especially when I was a kid, when prophecy was just a big thing, and you always had guys coming and speaking on prophecy, and they give these charts, and they got heaven here, earth here, and New Jerusalem in the middle, suspended in space. And they say, yeah, we're going to be going back and forth through space to New Jerusalem and heaven. I don't think that's what this is saying. What this is saying is that the new heaven and the new earth are going to be together. God is going to dwell with us, and that New Jerusalem will be on the earth. But it's not going to be a separation like there is a separation now. There's a distinct separation right now between earth and heaven. And so that's going to be qualitatively new. Now, I hope this doesn't disappoint you. And I hope it doesn't disappoint you that the present earth, the present heaven that you will go to when you die, and that your loved ones are in right now, will not be or is not as good as the final heaven will be. I hope that doesn't disappoint you. Some of you are saying, well, man, I thought it was all going to be just one thing. No, it's going to be two different heavens. So let's take a look at the heaven that we will go to when we die, because it's going to be qualitatively different than the one described for us in Revelation 21. In Revelation 21, just in case you're wondering, in verse 18, it says, the material of the wall was jasper, the city was pure gold like clear glass. It goes on and it tells us that the streets will be paved with gold. But again, that's the new heaven. That's not the heaven that your loved ones are in right now. Let me tell you about the heaven that your loved ones are in right now and the one that you will go to when you die. And let me tell you that you won't be disappointed with it at all. In Isaiah 66, verse 1, look over there, Isaiah 66, 1. We're told by the Lord, He says, Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. Now, the heaven that He's talking about is the present heaven. And He says, in comparison to earth, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. The word footstool comes from the Hebrew word harom. It literally means something to stomp your feet on so as to knock off the mud or the dust. And from this meaning was also derived the idea of a footstool being something that someone would rest their feet on as they're sitting in a chair. So in any respect, it was a very humbling term to be used of something, to call it a footstool. It was not a term of honor. It was not a term of glory or of majesty. It was a very humbling term. And what God is doing is saying that in comparison to heaven, which is the throne, earth is but a footstool. So the idea is that it's beautiful and glorious as earth ever was in its original state. It was still but a footstool compared to heaven, which was the throne of God. When you take your most beautiful spot on earth that you like to go to, the place that captivates your imagination with its beauty and its grandeur, that gives you the most peace and serenity, that just stills your heart when you're there and when you're enjoying it and when you're looking at it, and it is but a place for someone to knock the mud off their shoes in comparison to what heaven is like. And the real exciting thing, I think, is that once we get to heaven, we will experience heaven as something much greater than we have ever experienced on earth. But what's going to happen when you get to heaven and you begin to enjoy heaven is God's going to come up to you and He's going to ask you, are you enjoying this? And you're going to say, oh, immensely. And then God's going to say, well, you haven't seen anything yet, because there's still a new heaven that is going to come. In other words, even as we anticipate the present heaven right now, when you get to that present heaven, you will also be anticipating the new heaven even more. God says it will only get better. But the question I want to ask is this: is the heaven that you and I are going to go to when we die, and the heaven that our loved ones who know Jesus Christ are in right now, is it a real, physical, and material place? Or is it just a spiritual world? There are lots of people who believe that since we don't get our resurrected bodies until later, that we just go to this heaven and we just kind of exist as souls, and what can souls do? Well, what I want to show you is that the heaven that we go to is a real, physical, and material place. And that we will enjoy this place physically as well as spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. In his 17th century classic, Paradise Lost, John Milton depicted an angel named Raphael asking Adam this question: what if earth is but the shadow of heaven? What if earth is but the shadow of heaven? And Milton got that question from the book of Hebrews, because as he read the book of Hebrews, he saw that throughout the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews talked about the things on earth being mere copies or shadows of what was in heaven. For instance, if you go with me to Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Hebrews 8, 1 through 5. In Hebrews 8, 1 through 5, it says, now the main point in what has been said is this: we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary, and in the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, so it is necessary that this high priest also has something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. In other words, that whole tabernacle and actually the temple and the things that were there on earth were but a mere shadow and a copy of what is reality in heaven. In Hebrews chapter 9, verses 23 and 24. It says, therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens, some of the copies on earth of those things that are reality in heaven, to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. If you look at Hebrews 10:1, for the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things. In Colossians chapter 2, look over there, Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Colossians 2, 16 and 17. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And where Milton got the idea that earth is but the shadow or the copy of heaven is from here. And the question that he posed, which has been the question that theologians have wrestled with throughout the centuries, is simply this: when God created man in His image, did He also create earth in heaven's image? In other words, all of the good that you see on earth, that in and of itself is not sinful, even though it's cursed, even though it has been cursed because of the fall, but all of the good that you see on earth, even at its best, is but a shadow or a copy of the reality which exists in heaven. I think that is what the Bible teaches. I think that the Bible teaches that all the good things on earth, and again, I mean by those things that are good, they're not sinful in and of themselves, that they are but shadows or faded pictures of all of the unspoiled and spectacular realities that are found in heavens. In other words, our most majestic mountains are but shadows of the real thing that you will see and that you will enjoy and that you will climb when you get to heaven. Our flowers and our plants and our trees, as beautiful as the most majestic garden you could ever see would be, are but wilted shadows of the real flowers and the real gardens that you'll enjoy in heaven. The most spectacular and exciting thrill of your life here on earth is but an inkling of what you will experience when you experience the real thing in heaven. The wonderful joy and the comfort and the peace you feel when you get to go home and be with your family and everything's going good. Not bad, but when everything's going good and you just got that warm, peaceful feeling. You know the fire's lit, not right now, but you know, and things are good, that's going to be a mere whisper of what it will be like to be in heaven gathered with your heavenly family. The greatest love that you've ever known here on earth with another human being, as powerful and as intimate and as heartwarming as it was or will be, is but a warm, fuzzy feeling compared to the reality that you'll experience every day when you're in heaven. And again, the question, could it be that God, when He created man in His image, created earth in heaven's image? C.S. Lewis suggested that the hills and the valleys of heaven will be to those you now experience not as a copy is to the original, nor as a substitute is to the genuine article, but as the flower is to the root or the diamond is to the coal. In other words, all that we experience on earth that is good not only is a copy, but it finds its source in the real object which actually exists untainted by sin in heaven. You know, I think our thinking is backwards. And the reason it's backwards is because we are depraved and man-centered. Listen to what Randy Alcorn writes. I think this is a great argument. Listen to this. Why do we imagine that God patterns heaven's holy city after an earthly city? Now, when you think of that new city, Jerusalem, we think, well, He must have got that idea from us, right? He sees that we live in cities, a lot of us. And He got that idea from us. Why do we imagine that God patterns heaven's holy city after an earthly city? As if heaven knows nothing of community and culture and has to get its ideas from us? Isn't it more likely that earthly realities, including cities, are derived from heavenly counterparts? We tend to start with earth and we reason up toward heaven, when instead we should start with heaven and reason down to earth. And probably the greatest example of that is marriage. It's marriage. We think that God needed an illustration to illustrate Christ's love for the church. So He looked all over and, marriage. I'll use marriage as an illustration. And the love that the husband has for his wife, that's what I'll use to illustrate the love that Christ has for His church. Is that the way God did it? Or did Christ's love for the church come first, and that's why He created marriage, Ephesians chapter 5? And He said this, listen, this is the way it is. Christ loves His church with this kind of love, and in marriage, that's the kind of love you need to have. In other words, He gives us a copy of it, a shadow of it, a picture of it on earth to show us what the reality is in heaven. And you can find that throughout the Bible. I think that if you really were to take the Bible and look at everything it says about heaven, all the physical realities that it talks about, you would see that those physical realities have counterparts in heaven. And that the reality in heaven is perfect, whereas what we experience on earth is just the shadow. It's just the foretaste of what's going to come. And so again, when you take the most pleasurable and enjoyable experience that you've ever had on earth, keep in mind all you have enjoyed is a shadow. All you're enjoying is a copy. The reality is still yet to come. And if the copies and the shadows are real and physical and material, then the realities they picture must be even more so. They must be even more so. So yeah, heaven is a real, physical, material place. Now look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul writes in verse 1, "For we know that if the earthly tent which is our house is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." Listen, when our body dies and we go to heaven, we will enjoy heaven as a physical, material, real place. We won't have our resurrected bodies. You don't get those till later. But somehow, some way, God is going to allow you to experience this in a physical way. Now, it shouldn't be a stretch for us to say, well, maybe God's going to give us a temporary body. You say, oh, no. Well, let me ask you this. What are you living in? You have a problem with God giving you another one? Because that's all you're living in right now is a temporary body. So is it too hard for God to say, listen, I'm not going to give you your resurrected, glorified body until later, but you're going to have a temporary body that you will experience the realities of heaven in. It says, "For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life." You know, when someone's dying, it's really an unscriptural thought to say death is closing in on them. You know what's more scriptural? Life is closing in on them. Because when you die, the mortal is going to be swallowed up by immortality. You're going to be swallowed up by life. Now, He who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave to us the Spirit as a pledge, the down payment, and the one who feeds our soul and our imagination with what heaven will be like. In Luke chapter 23:43, when the thief on the cross who believed in Jesus asked Jesus, "Remember me," or said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom," what did Jesus say to him? "Today you shall be with me in" what? Paradise. Today you shall be with me in paradise. That's Luke 23:43. He didn't say tomorrow. He didn't say in a couple of weeks. He said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Now, it would be enough just to be with Christ, but He added in paradise. The word paradise is an Oriental word which comes from the Persians. It means a garden. That's what it means, a garden. And you're going, oh, a garden. That means a garden. A park, an enclosure that is full of plants, flowers, vegetables of every kind. That's what paradise meant. It did not mean a garden with one kind of plant in it, like a tomato garden or an onion garden, my favorite vegetable. It was a garden that included a multiplicity and a variety of different kinds of plants and vegetables and trees and life, all kinds of life in there. And that's what the Persians meant. Now, the Greek Septuagint uses that word to translate in Genesis the Garden of Eden, so that the Greek Septuagint actually translates it Paradise of Eden. Now, I told you last week that Eden means pleasure. The Hebrew word for Eden means pleasure, plural. So in other words, when Jesus is saying to the thief, "Today you shall be with me in paradise," what He's saying is, today you're going to be with me in the garden of pleasures. You're going to be with me in a garden of a multiplicity of pleasures, because a garden has all kinds of plants and vegetables, all kinds of varieties. And the point that Jesus is making is this: when you get to heaven, there's going to be a variety of pleasures. a multiplicity of joys that you will be able to experience. Probably all custom designed with you in mind. Don't you find it kind of interesting that Jesus often retired to the garden? I wonder if there wasn't just a special place in His heart for that garden, because it reminded Him of what He had left. You know, there's a great deal more to say, and our time is gone, and we'll talk a little bit about it next week. But in closing, let me just say this, that heaven is a real, physical, material place. It's a place of immense pleasures. And it's a place of immense pleasures, the reality of all pleasure, because God is there. That's why. Because God is there. We experience the Lord in a very real way, but we experience the Lord still with a certain amount of a veil, because we operate by faith. We don't operate by sight. When we get to heaven, we get to operate by sight. The idea being that we will know as we are fully known. Well, not that we're going to have a comprehensive knowledge of God, but we will have a correct knowledge of God. And because we are with Him in heaven and there is no longer a separation, we will experience Him in a way that we've never experienced Him on earth. As good as our experience here is, it will get better when we get to earth, and it will continue to grow because we will continue to know God better and better and better. It will ever increasingly be a place of joy. But heaven will always be a place of pleasure, untainted by sin, untainted by guilt, because God is there. That's why David said in Psalm 16:11 when he praised God, he said this, in your presence is fullness of joy, and in your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Heaven will be pleasurable because God is there. That's why he said in Psalm 36:8, when he was talking about those who are in God's house, God's dwelling place, God's abode, heaven, he said this, they will drink the fill of the abundance of your house. They will drink the fill, or drink to the fill, of the abundance of your house, and you give them to drink of the river of your delights. That's the word Eden, the river of your pleasures. Note that those who are with God are drinking their fill of the abundance of heaven. Heaven and pleasure is all about God and all about being with God, which is why hell is a place with absolutely no pleasure whatsoever, because God is not there. You know, in the words of John Wesley, when it comes to heaven, the best is yet to be. The best is yet to be. Heaven is going to be a place of ever-increasing joy, ever-increasing happiness, ever-increasing pleasure, because heaven will be a place in which you will be ever-increasing in your understanding and in your knowledge and in your fellowship with God. And since God is infinite, you will never come to a point in heaven where you totally drink your fill of God. It will always get better all the time. Therefore, heaven will always get better. Heaven will increase in joy every day. It'll get better every day. Whereas hell will simply get worse. It'll simply get worse. The best is yet to be. And now that John Wesley has been in heaven for 217 years, I'm sure that he, while having drunk his fill of God's pleasures every day for those 217 years, is still saying, the best is yet to be. Helen Keller, who lived 86 of her 88 years, blind, deaf, and unable to speak, wrote this, "For 3 things I thank God every day of my life." Now keep in mind, 86 years of her 88 years. Blind, deaf, and unable to speak. For three things I thank God every day of my life. Thanks that He has given me knowledge of His works. Deep thanks that He has set in my darkness the lamp of faith. Deepest thanks that I have another life to look forward to. A life joyous with light and flowers and heavenly song. You know, regardless of what your troubles are, you have a life to look forward to. Your life is not bound up here in your things and in your troubles and in our persecutions and in our temptations that we struggle with and in negative people. Our life is not bound here. We have another life to live in which those things will all be taken care of, and we'll not experience those things ever again. Let me ask us who are Christians just a couple questions, and then we'll close. And I'd like you to take these questions to heart. Is there really any trial we are going through, any temptation we are struggling with, or any discouragement that we are living with that we cannot endure and cannot joyously work to overcome in light of the fact that heaven is our future? Is there really anything we can't get through? Number two, is there any ministry so hard or act of service so low that we cannot involve ourselves in joyously in light of the fact that heaven is coming closer every day? Number three, is there any reason why instead of forgiving those you think have done something to you, you rather would allow a root of bitterness to spring up so that you are angry and bitter and uninvolved and callous and hard? Is there a reason why you won't forgive when you know heaven is so close? Is there any reason why we continue to grieve for those who have gone on to heaven before us when we know they are drinking their fill of God's delights every moment of every day? Is there any reason why we Christian parents would discourage our children from risking their lives or simply depriving their lives of worldly treasure in service for Christ when we know heaven is their real home? Why would you be afraid to let your child go to some distant place and serve God when you know that heaven's their home? And finally, is there any reason to be afraid of getting older and dying when we know that death is nothing more than the passageway to heaven? What's there to be afraid of? Actually, there was one more. Is there any reason why we don't give of our earthly treasure to the work of God so as to be storing up treasure in heaven rather than on earth when we know that our earthly treasure will rust, will rot, and will be lost, and everything committed to heaven will be reserved securely for us when we get there? Heaven is the reality, and heaven really is the place that defines every other place. It's the reality. This is just the shadow. It's just a shadow, just a copy. One day we'll experience the reality. Let's pray. Father, I thank You for what You have given us to know about heaven. We thank You. It is a real place. It's where our treasure is. It's where our rewards are. It's where our inheritance is. It's where our saved loved ones live. It's where You are. It's home. This is not home. And Father, as we contemplate a world and a nation that is getting worse, with struggles and trials and tribulations that will only increase and will only become more and more severe. Help us to realize that this is not our home. Heaven is. And because heaven is our home, there is nothing that we can lose in using our resources and even our very lives in making much of you by serving others who don't know you. Thank you for doing that with our mission team the last couple weeks. Thank you for giving us people who desired to make much of you by investing their lives in people who need to know that heaven could be their real home too. In Jesus' name, amen.